Retro gaming is fun and old video games can be gratifying experiences, but the culture shock can be huge coming in fresh from modern games. There are few concessions you have to make to be able to fully enjoy the hobby. I'll tell you 4 things from outdated graphics to flat out bad controls you just need to accept to level up your experience with old games. I also talk about my experience and how I dealt these issues. Let's begin with the big one, the graphics. Everybody knows just by looking at the old games that they don't look too hot. While 2D graphics that have sprites and parallax scrolling background layers can be quite charming these days, there is also the dreaded 32-bit console generation that introduced 3D polygons for the first time to the mainstream gaming market. And more often than not, these graphics aren't considered that appealing these days, and I agree purely from a technical standpoint. I can tolerate this generation of games purely with my unconditional love and nostalgia for these games because they were an important part of my life when I was a teenager growing up to adulthood. If you didn't experience these games firsthand back then, it can be really hard to get into them and appreciate them. Kind of the same thing for me with any stuff older than NES or C64, like Atari 2600 stuff, because those were before my times. I don't have nostalgia for Atari 2600 games. To me they are just primitive, outdated video games, but people who experienced them back then have big nostalgia for them. Same for me with the crude low poly affine texture streaming PS1 games. Either way, if you have nostalgia for them or not, you just have to accept them how they are to appreciate and enjoy them. Fortunately, we have several ways to alleviate this little and make old games more digestible visually. Whether it's trying to achieve the best possible picture quality on a modern display on a real thing or enhancing the experience using software emulators. Latter can make a big difference, especially in these older 3D polygon-based games, because you can run them on your display's native resolution, improve frame rates via hacks and overclocking, and even make them widescreen. You can even fix that affine texture streaming in PS1 games, or even make them blurry to look like N64 games, if you prefer that. On top of that, you can use your modern controllers and any controller. Use Xbox controllers to play PlayStation games or vice versa, it's up to you. I will talk about more controls later in this video. Of course, with 2D games it is what it is, nothing much you can do, but make sure that you are using even scaling to avoid blurry images and shimmering when the screen is scrolling. How did I get over the bad graphics when I started to go back to the past? I used to be what you'd call a graphics. It was all about graphics for me for the longest time. Of course, my nostalgia towards these games helped, but also the fact that modern video games aren't made for me as a player anymore most of the time. I just decided to take the hit and accept that if I wanted to enjoy video games again, I needed to be able to play games that don't look cutting edge anymore. And you know what? I got used to it, that it doesn't bother me a bit anymore. It's rather fun to go back to any given era and system and experience what was considered cutting edge back then. Some things, especially on 6th gen machines, can be very convincing and still look very good even today. Let's talk about some more of those early 3D games. One thing about them besides outdated graphics is the nature of the lack of standards and good practices from the development standpoint on how 3D games would work and the lack of standardized input devices for 3D games. This often led to problematic camera behavior in games and usually players not having any or at least proper control of it like we have these days in modern games. This is one of the biggest culture shocks you will have if you have never played these old 3D games before or haven't revisited them until now. You might have forgotten how it was. It's very different just to watch someone playing these old games than playing them yourself, when you naturally would like to move the camera around and then it hits you that you simply can't. There are two options at this point, either quit or just get used to it. This is one of those things, Even if you were around 20 years ago playing games on your new hotness that was PS2, you probably don't even remember that you couldn't control the game camera like today. For example, in my recent revisit of GTA Vice City on PS2, I experienced just that. I didn't remember that you can't freely control the camera in that game, at least not in the original PS2 version. Some games behave very well, and similarly to modern games, mainly first-person shooters and racing games, even though controls might not be what you expect. For example, Blood Rain 2 on PS2 behaves almost like a modern game, but this is an exception in games from this era. You can fully control the camera, rebind all controls and change both axis directions. Lots of modern games don't allow you to freely rebind all controls. This was in 2004, they started to figure it out at the time. Another game that almost plays like a modern game is Psyops Mindgate Conspiracy, also for the PS2. You can freely control the camera and change directions of the axis controls, but aiming your weapons is still more of an old school stuff. We have talked about outdated graphics and problematic cameras and lack of control of them. If you are willing to accept these things, you are on your way to enjoying retro games. I dealt with this issue by simply remembering the fact that every game didn't play like all the other ones back then, and it can be even refreshing to play something that feels fresh almost every time, because something else than the skin of the game changes. Of course, it can be very frustrating at times when you practically are asked to forget a decade and a half's worth of muscle memory, but it can be done. Let's talk about those controls next. Back then pretty much every game had different control schemes because things weren't standardized yet and the best practices weren't figured out yet. Again, this is mostly a concern in the early 3D era of gaming, like PlayStation, Saturn and N64, but stretches even to the 6th generation of consoles. But also older games, mainly 2D era, had some weird things going on, especially the threaded buttons are backward thing. For example, most of the time you'd jump with A and do actions with B in side-scrolling action games and platformers. But when these controls were swapped around sometimes, it can be a real pain to fight against your decades worth of muscle memory. Of course, when using emulators you can just easily swap the controls to make it work out. But again, on a real thing you are SOL and just need to accept it. As I said earlier, this is more of a problem with the early 3D games because nobody really knew what they were doing and input devices were different on all systems, unlike these days when they are basically exactly the same on every platform. This was especially rough before they had any analog sticks on them, and some of them had only one for years, like N64, Saturn's 3D pad, and Sega stubbornly kept that same layout with Dreamcast controller. Yes, there's a 6th generation console with only one analog stick on the controller, and GameCube's yellow little nipple isn't much better, but at least it's there and works for its intended purpose, controlling the camera. The N64 controller had these 4 yellow C buttons, camera buttons for that job, but as a result had only 2 action face buttons. Sony's analog controller and later DualShock that added the rumble feature got it right. All Nintendo had to do with the Super Nintendo controller was to slap 2 sticks on it, like Sony did. Let's face it, the PlayStation controller was pretty much the SNES controller only with the extra shoulder buttons and better ergonomics. PlayStation was supposed to be a Super Nintendo CD-ROM add-on after all. That original DualShock design is pretty much the layout we even use today on modern controllers. But even when the controller problem was solved going into the PS2 generation, developers still didn't manage to make those standards yet. There are lots of games in this generation where you still can't control the camera properly, as we discussed earlier. And even if they did, at this time inverting the Y-axis was considered the standard way to control vertical camera movement. And it's fine for some people, like me, who do that naturally. The problem is that some people prefer it to be another way around. Back then it was usually inverted and no option to change this. And sometimes it was in the other way around, you'd call normal these days, and couldn't change it, meaning people who prefer the inverted were out of luck. And again, if you are using emulators to enjoy old games, you can easily swap this around to make it work for you. This is one of the reasons I'm a big fan of software emulators, because they can make the retro gaming experience simply better. Less accurate maybe, but accurate doesn't always mean better, at least to me. The camera controls aren't the only issues with controls throughout the history of gaming. There is a myriad of different control problems during different eras, like unresponsive or laggy controls that plague some games. Not having an inverted Y-axis on camera control is one thing I just can't get used to, so I just don't play games that force me to use so-called normal settings, at least not on real hardware. Looks like you enjoy content like this. Why not subscribe to this channel for more? Thanks. The game designs themselves of course changed radically at different points in history of gaming, but maybe the biggest difference between modern AAA games and high production value games back then was the lack of open world we have in most AAA stuff these days. Honestly, it's so refreshing to have carefully produced and crafted experiences instead of stupidly large empty worlds to waste my time in. My point here is that if you are someone who actually enjoys these empty worlds today, you have to adapt to game designs before those empty open worlds to enjoy old games. They may feel like linear corridors or maze-like in some cases at first, especially when going back to early 1990s first-person shooters for example. Games were designed to certain experiences in mind over to experience the life of this character in this big open world like they are these days. Of course, some games could be categorized as somewhat open world, like many 3D platformers like Jumping Flash, where you had actual freedom of movement, or my all-time favorite game Super Mario 64. And no wonder we ended up with open world games, because that's exactly what people wanted back then, me included. I remember reading back then from my local video games magazine Superpower, in the Mario 64 review they said something like this: "It's pure 3D, complete freedom of movement." It was praised to high heavens. That's exactly what made me fall in love with that game in the first place. The difference with modern stuff is that it's not just window dressing. That world was full of meaningful stuff to do. We had the beauty of having more different types of games back then. Sure, racing games were racing games, fighting games were fighting games, etc. But I mean, we had lots of different genres of games we really don't have anymore, especially in the AAA stage, like real-time strategy games. I wish EA remade other Command & Conquer games, and especially Red Alert 2 like they did the original Command & Conquer and Red Alert. That package is amazing. Of course, we have lots of indie games these days doing things big budget games don't, but they just don't do it for me. If I want to play something that looks old, I play something actually old that looked bleeding edge when it came out. On the other hand, if you enjoy playing some indie games that are reminiscent of the games of the past, you shouldn't have too much of a problem enjoying old games as well. Because at that point you are more than likely already given up modern shiny graphics and big empty open worlds. This one was really never an issue for me, because I have grown so sick and tired of modern open world busywork games, games with optional pay with real money balance adjustments. I hope this video helped you to decide if you should dive into the fascinating world of retro gaming or not, or if you are already enjoying retro gaming, it provides you with some entertainment. If you want to know more about why I think old games are better than modern games, watch my 30-minute video I made about it by clicking it on your screen now. Thanks for watching and bye for now.